Imagine waking up and the water doesn't run. The story behind the moment is a system. This is the ripple effect. We use that podcast from Willows Institute about forces of shaping our future. Today we're diving into the story of freshwater, why stress is rising, the system behind the crisis, and how young people are stepping up to change the flow. And the center of all of this, Carl Ganter, a journalist turned system thinker whose work is connecting data, communities, and decision makers around the world. I'm Sata, and together with Olivia, we are Villa Fellows that are going to be your hosts for this episode. Let's dive into it.
So, Carl, why don't you first introduce yourself really quick?
Yeah, so I'm Carl Ganter, and I am all about ripple effects. So I love being on your podcast. Thank you for having me. So I started as a journalist and photojournalist as a youngster, actually in ninth grade, and eventually grew to understanding that storytelling is really important to not only to capture and to be on the front lines and to learn and to see human history evolve, but also for change. And so I went from being a photojournalist and reporter to founding an organization called Circle of Blue. And Circle of Blue is a nonprofit news organization covering freshwater issues around the world, and then also really from a systemic lens.
Okay, nice. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you mean by systemic lens?
Yeah, so the world's facing really grand challenges, and they're all interconnected. We're on one little blue planet against a black sky. And when we look to the stars and we look for life, we're looking for water. That's the first indication. That's what we're looking for when we look up. But if we look around us, we're all water. We're 75% water ourselves, right? That's kind of neat. But we also face grand challenges. Our freshwater supply, our freshwater cycle is broken, and yet it's so important to life. And so how do we fix that? And it's complicated. Freshwater is complicated, and it touches everything we care about. When you're talking freshwater, you're talking about food. You're talking about energy. You're talking about health. You're talking about equity. And so really when we're looking at a grand challenge, or really the most compelling, dramatic story of our era, it's water.
I think that's really, really, really nice to hear about. And I think almost water isn't talked about enough when we're discussing climate change and sustainability. So I think that's nice of what you're doing.
How do you feel about the fact that a lot of issues are discussed in very small groups and people from different sectors all around them? And how do you find that interdisciplinary concept, how important it is for you and for your work?
Yeah, so the interdisciplinary concept of systems change, it's hard to see, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. So that's what's, I think, systems leadership is all about, and systems thinking is when you push on one thing, that means something else happens over here. It's a cause and effect. And so water is kind of that ultimate equalizer or connector. And so when we're looking at systems challenges, when we look at a through line, as they call it, I call it a blue thread, and that's why I think of water as a ripple effect or a tidal effect, because it is such a big drama around the world. And when we start looking at these complex systems, we really have to step back and see, who are the players, who's missing, who's segregated or in a silo over here, and who's not talking to, who are the people that are obviously missing or not obviously in the room. And that sounds complicated. But what we need to do is take a moment and step back, in a sense, take a systems view, almost an orbital perspective. Take a deep breath, as is said here at the VR Symposium and VR Summit. Go slow to run fast. So slow down for a second, take a deep breath, assess the situation, and then run fast.
Thank you so much for your answer. And Carl, honestly, I feel like you're an amazing speaker and such a good storyteller. What is the best way to bridge the gap between the data, the scientific aspect of water that you work a lot with, and the effective narrative to bring people and to make them connect to that?
Well, to connect them better first, and to pick up on your earlier question too, is that we take a lot of our natural resources for granted, and particularly water. And water has defied rising on the local, national, and global agendas. And water usually is set off to the side. We'll do water later. It's taken for granted until it's gone. And yet the water cycle is broken. We're seeing too much water, we're seeing more flooding, or we're seeing too little water, we're seeing droughts. Conflict over water is up 50% over the last year. That's a record. It's mean fighting over water. So over eons, water has defined whether civilizations thrive or fail. And yet we still take the most basic thing for granted. One reason is because we don't value it properly. We expect it to be delivered to us for free, or to pump it from the ground, or scoop it from a river. And we don't want to pay for it. And there just feels like there is a right that water will be delivered to us by our communities in some sense. And so we're really working to change that by changing the lens of storytelling, but also in data. What's water actually mean to us? Make it real and visible. Where is the water going away? Where is the water actually going? Is it clean? Is it polluted? So we can actually bring a level of awareness and almost love for water, because it's so close to us. Sometimes the things that we hold dearest, we push away, right? This seems like human nature in many ways. But when we can marry data and story, then we start to get a really virtuous feedback loop. So then we start to see ourselves in the picture. We start to see what's bad, and then we start to see, and we can map where we actually want to go. So I used to work at a television station in Chicago, and we used to say you'd scare them on Sunday and save them on Monday. And oftentimes in our media and our storytelling, whether we're an NGO or a company, we scare people. In the journalism world, sometimes we say we're documenting our demise. Great for us. Now that's cheerful. Or we save people, which means that, okay, here's a solution. We're going to send, Venmo or tweet or whatever, whatever way, we're going to donate a few dollars to our favorite cause, and over there in another community, or even to a local community, and we've done our job, right? That's not good enough. And so how do we motivate the large scale kind of engagement? And that's going to come from story and data, and also really concerted effort to make the future visible. So aligning, scare people, here's what's happening, don't scare them into the corner, but invite them into the solution, so that then we can choose to go in a direction that's positive. If we just scare people, they'll step away. It's too big. If we just say people, hey, send $1, or it's already fixed, I don't need to participate.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. And it's something that's always spoken about here at Villars, the power of storytelling. So I have two questions. First, would you say that storytelling is, because you mentioned silos before, would you say storytelling is a way that you're trying to, as a tool that you use, a tool, would you say storytelling is the tool you use to break down these silos that you speak of?
I think storytelling is one of the universal solvents, because that's what we are as humans. We're storytellers, gathered around the fires and told stories about our ancestors thousands of years ago, and the same story was passed along, and it was our culture, our thread. So storytelling is essential, and it's a way of building community, building empathy, building trust. As we keep hearing, trust is a currency, and that currency is overspent. We have a huge trust breakdown in the world right now, and story can bridge that. However, what story are you going to tell? There's a very poignant interlude in the musical Hamilton. Who will tell your story? It's really touching. So you wonder who will tell your story. Well, but then you ask, okay, who are you telling the story to? So I often hear, we'll tell the story and we'll get it out there. We'll go get media. Well, media. what media today? If you're really realistic, our media is wildly fragmented. Um, and there is a misconception that by telling a story and getting it out there, that either the world will change or, hey, we've told a story and we've dented the world a little bit. What we really need to do is, yes, we need to tell the story in a really compelling way. We need to understand what's the strategic value of that story. We need to understand who we want to reach and, what is that segment of the story that's going to be relevant in a way they see themselves in the picture, not in a passive way that they click like and they move on, but in a way it's like and, ooh, that's me. That's either me in the future in a positive way or me in something I need to act, or, oh my gosh, our forests are really dry. Maybe I ought to start talking about forest fires, right? Or about water management. And so really the two things that we need to focus on beyond getting that really compelling content, not just like a 30-second TikTok with just, hey, isn't this cool? We need to look at who do we want to reach with that story and what do we want them to do? Oftentimes, what do we want them to do is the hardest, because we'll tell a story, we get people, again, like scare them or save them. What do we actually want them to do? And then back to who are we targeting? Because for systems change, you need public awareness. And again, that's another amorphous term. Let's go get awareness. But you need public awareness, but then you need to figure out who are the systems leaders. It could be a farmer in Punjab who lets his pump run 24 hours a day because electricity is free, and everybody looks to him or her and emulates that action because they're either they're the leader, perceived leader. So if you target that one farmer who then turns off their well and says, well, we don't need to be pumping water 24 hours a day, then you might get 1 million farmers to stop draining the aquifers in northern India.
Bouncing off of what you just said about future and how important it is to deliver a message. Okay, so basically what I wanted to ask is that a mode of a story that you told that made an impact that you perceived?
So in journalism, our biggest, the biggest opportunity or actually honor is, of course, is for somebody to share their story with you and to build that level of trust. And you're the bridge, right? You're the storyteller. You're the listener. So one, you have to listen really carefully and be perceptive, and then also somehow translate that into, into something that's compelling, that people will read or watch or somehow be engaged with. And that story could be done through art, it could be through words, it could be through photos. And so I'll tell 2 short stories of change. So one, probably the greatest day in my career still was in graduate school. And that was driving the wife of a man who'd been wrongfully convicted of murder, driving her to the prison and watching her husband walk free because of my master's project that I'd done with a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. And it's still for me is pretty emotional because 1.5 years worth of work, a hunch, an idea, looking at academically how the justice system was working and having an idea that they might have the wrong person in prison, and then pursuing that and actually unraveling a really complicated drama of a story that was enrapturing everyone in Chicago. And so the long tail of that story, which also included such dramatic scenes, it was not as romantic as it sounds, but I did a stakeout of our murder suspect. We actually found the real killer too in the story, as a graduate student. And so to me, it's still kind of hard to believe, but seeing the long tail of that after David DeWallaby walked free in Chicago, we turned the lens on who was the real killer. And then Northwestern University started, this is the butterfly wing effect, started the Center for Wrongful Convictions, and then also assigned undergraduate students to research death row cases. And they have since gotten more than a dozen people off death row, showing they've been wrongfully convicted. So that's one that's a little off track, but for water, but it showed me that by having a compelling story, a drama, everybody's seeing the picture. It was very, top of the news, having access to some trust, a family that would tell you the story and let you in, having multiple channels of distribution, reaching key people that then triggered more information and more engagement. So that is one example.
Thank you so much for sharing the story. I feel like our young listeners, change makers, could definitely take this big piece of advice from yourself.
I feel like that's so. I have no words, honestly. That's amazing. What made you pursue it? What made you so sure that he hadn't done it? Like, why? Because what I'm trying to get to is I feel like a lot of youth can be discouraged because of current inaction by policymakers and people who have power to do something. So I feel like almost in this situation, you were in that place. So how did you continue the motivation?
So that's a really good question. Continuing motivation against an embedded system,
Yeah.
right? And preconceptions and stereotypes. Well, everybody was convinced that they'd done it, that he was guilty, but it was all circumstantial. Now, we didn't know if he'd done it or not, but we knew there was an amazing story. So as an academic project, we interviewed the man's wife and got her to tell all the behind the scenes detail about being in the middle of a murder case. And that was just sometimes you read a book and it's for entertainment or curiosity. That was really compelling. And we were so compelled that what the points that she brought up were so almost, astronomically out there. It's like, if 10% of this is right, then, we have to follow this. And so we didn't know to start that we were onto a breaking up murder case. And that actually, the embedded system did push back because the politicians and law enforcement believed that they caught the right person. And so, there were times that we actually received a threat of obstructing a federal investigation. But fortunately, by then we had some support behind us where we could take, like a Marvel superhero, we could take that mirror and bounce it back at them, so they couldn't intimidate us. But there was another story. So what I learned is that created a feedback loop, is that it was cumulative. It wasn't a one-time story, which is usually journalism and storytelling is oftentimes linear, a beginning, a middle, and an end. You're writing, producing something, done, send, hope somebody reads it, listens to it, right? I hope our listeners are interested. But then how do you turn that into actually systems change? And so in a small way, we applied that to, and sometimes it starts by asking simple questions. Why? Right? And then listening. Why? And why? You just kind of keep asking. Then what happened? And so we're looking at water. So by then it started Circle of Blue. Afterwards, I worked at Time Magazine, started working for Time when I was a sophomore in college in Chicago, and then went to National Geographic, was assigned to the U.S. Deep Caving Team. So some adventure photography and kind of crazy things. And then Time Magazine sent me to Asia to cover infectious diseases for 4 months, talk about an adventure. It was usually the assignments nobody else wanted, but truly these were frontline dramas. So by the time we really saw that water was a connective thread between everything I'd been doing. I grew up on Lake Michigan and in the woods in northern Michigan. And so by then with Circle Blue started asking why, what's this water energy connection thing? And we'd done some work in the US, but then we went to China and we started asking questions about China, because China is, where China goes, the rest of the world tends to go. It's a tug and pull. And so we wanted to ask a simple question, just like, who did it? Did they do it in Chicago? But we asked a simple question. Does China have enough water to mine and process coal and cool their power plants in Inner Mongolia. We didn't go like, hey, let's do water in China. That's an amorphous story. You could write, a million words on that and nobody read it. But what is the drama that's happening now that's really interesting and that's of consequence? And so in a short version of this, we were able to deploy, this is before COVID, we were able to deploy 4 separate teams in China, a journalist, a translator, a data researcher, um, somebody helped guide. And we went to Inner Mongolia and we went to the mines and the mills and statistics bureaus and captured data about how much water there was, how much groundwater there was, how the mines and the mills were draining the groundwater and the grasslands were turning to sand. I mean, pretty compelling, right? That looks interesting on data, but graphs and charts and pictures of mines and mills and power plants, okay, that's nice. But I went and stayed with an Inner Mongolian shepherd family, and their kids actually took me all around and was able to profile this transition as the mines were getting closer to their grasslands. Their wells were going dry, which they used for water for their sheep. And you imagine when I say Inner Mongolia grasslands, you picture green, you picture sheep, and you picture gers or yurts, right? That's what was there, but this was going away because these mines were marching closer and closer. But long story short, we did 18 stories out of that research and reporting, because we did a story about the shepherd's daughter's life, right? We did a story about the mines. We did a separate story about the mills, So we had this whole portfolio, and you publish, right? So we're back to linear. Okay, right? I publish, great, move on. We published in Chinese. We also published in English. We cross-published with some of this with the World Economic Forum, with the Wilson Center in Washington. Good for us, right? What's next? So being hopelessly naive, we went back to China and we said, who do we want to reach with this story? This is really compelling. So we went back, we did 17 convenings across China. It was almost like a reading hour, at the bookstore. So we targeted the U.S. Embassy, and they brought in their consulate staff because they identified what we had found of national security interest, because it was a threat to China's GDP growth. Because here were power plants that could go dry in Inner Mongolia for the grid or in their mines. And we did the Yellow River Commission in Ningxia, China, and 1,200 people came to our PowerPoint. And then we did the water minister of China, a briefing for him. Now, you would think that we're bringing, and this is cabinet level, you would think that we're bringing him bad news. Well, I mean, this is pretty scary. Inner Mongolia, big, northern China, and their energy security. He loved it. Talk about finding that right person to tell the story to in the right way. So you start off with a little vignette of Wu Yan, the shepherd's daughter, and then you go deep into the data and you show, what's happening. So you grab their heart and then you back it up with data. He loved it because we gave him standing. Now he could go to the infrastructure minister and say, hey, if you want to fill that canal, you got to talk to me. If you want to cool that power plant and mine that coal, you've got to talk to me. After our convenings, we also did one in Davos, the World Economic Forum, a scenario session. And we got one on Capitol Hill in Washington. And I got a call from the U.S. Department of State that said, hey, nice work. President Xi has moved water and energy up their agenda to a national security issue. And when I went back to Inner Mongolia, the power plants that we mentioned had been torn down. So we really helped push China's further investment in wind and solar. And for that, I won the Rockefeller Foundation's Centennial Innovation Award for Impact.
Wow. Okay. That's amazing.
And I have the pictures to prove it.
Okay, I'd love to see them later. I think what stood out to me most is when you mentioned that when you brought it to cabinet, they loved it because they were relevant. Yeah, I just realized how significant it is that people don't really care unless you can make them feel special.
Yeah, China was almost, it was obvious. Well, of course they're likely, but nobody had actually gone to find out. And the point of relevancy and seeing yourself in the picture. Now, a lot of these stories are really big today, right? Whether it's Mexico City facing a huge water crisis, or Bangor, Bogota, Johannesburg, we can make those lists. We can go do that huge, big story. And that's great. But then we can also imagine it as a big iceberg, right? But you can look at the iceberg from different angles, and you've got the core, but maybe you're putting different flags in it for different audiences. So you've got the trusted data, you've done the research, the work. You've got almost this library of story that you created, but it'd be the same gathering of content. So we weren't just targeting, let's just get it out there. We're saying we're going to slice this piece off or put a lens on this body of work in a particular way for this particular audience, and then make sure that there's that the story and the data are trusted, and it's presented in a way that's not condemning, like these people were bad, right? And a way that, again, they could see themselves in the picture and they could see an opportunity to change. Because again, oftentimes we prescribe or we come up with a solution and we say you have to go this way, but there is a process, and it doesn't have to be belabored. We did China all in about 6 months, 6 or 8 months.
Wow.
And then we brought in 2 universities, 2 US, 2 Chinese, and then we brought together the US national labs and did a scientific exchange around what we'd found. So then that flywheel of solutions actually started to spin up more afterwards.
I find it really impressive how you take this lead into going into somewhere new place and taking this risk. What advice would you give to young people to take risks and go out there and reach something they want to reach, and to go as far as they can and take their full capacities to go out there?
Somebody asked me, what's the one thing that I value the most besides, family members, or that I would just feel really sad to lose. And that's my license to be curious. It's like, well, what's over there? Why? And then something I also learned in just by probably running a lot of walls, but also by being curious, is that, pick the right story, pick something that you're really interested in. And then no matter what happens, there'll be a kind of a no regrets exploration. And so go find out, and be relentless. And then also realize, well, maybe this is a dead end. Maybe this story isn't going to go anywhere. Maybe in Chicago, we did one interview and a big story, a profile, and well, there's nothing more. And we were willing to do that. But follow the leads. And as high school or college, there is a license to be curious in all caps, because if you ask questions, if you ask people in a gentle way but persistent, you also have a license to be persistent, to say, hey, I'd like to learn more, and just be curious and say, can you tell me how you did that? Would you be a guide? Could I have a 30-minute call so I know what questions to ask? And then also be really good listener, and be really perceptive. As we said, slow down and just look around and say, oh, that's really interesting. Oh, that's out of place. What's up with that? And then I think you can apply that license. But when I was in high school, I was curious. I lived in a little town in Michigan, still do. And I wanted to be a photojournalist. And so I wrote to more than 30 famous photojournalists, people whose pictures were the covers of Time and National Geographic. And I got really nice notes back, some handwritten still. And they all said, I asked if I could tag along on assignment, and they all said no. And one, the managing editor of an agency that represented a lot of these photographers, they were sitting around, and the photographers sitting around talking, and these are the people in the front lines, Pulitzer Prize winners, World Press winners, the best. and somebody opened, like literally, I mailed the letters. Got to figure I'll do it a little differently. And one opened and said, I got a letter from this kid, and it's like, oh, you got one too. And so finally, then the director of this agency wrote me back and said, if you're ever in New York, stop by. Of course I did. I went to New York with a little help from my parents, and I went to this agency. And I went and shadowed them for a day. Just, they were so busy, I just watched, like sit here and, don't touch anything. That was a Thursday. Second day, I had just turned 16. Second day, I went back. My parents' art seeing museum or whatever else. I went back, and basically I'm back. And they put me in a corner to look at pictures and just, kind of whatever. And it was fascinating. Fun listening to phone calls, and as they're cutting in calls from the front lines, I'm, sending these pictures from whatever, that literally history being, captured. This ethos that they had, a duty to see, right? And that's pretty powerful. So Friday evening, I'm still there, and the managing editor who'd written me, he's turning out the lights. And I'm still there. My parents are off for whatever, and they'd left me there. And he said, well, what are you doing? And I was like, well, what are you doing? And so we went and stopped, got a slice of pizza on Broadway, and we went up to Newsweek magazine then, was still a big thing. We went up to Newsweek. Second day in New York, from Traverse City, Michigan, I met the director of photography of Newsweek magazine. Dropped off some pictures there, talked. I was kind of in the corner, but introduced. Then we had to run another errand. We went to Time magazine. And I saw them negotiate for picture placement. And the sale of some pictures had been come from the front lines. And I walked down the hall, and here they were laying out the magazine up on the wall, the different international editions, getting ready to go to press. This is probably 10 p.m. now on a Friday night. Magazine closed at midnight. Went back and I met the director of photography. And he then, on midnight on Friday nights, would convene all these great photographers and writers from around the world in his big office, and they would talk about their stories from the front lines. And I thought that was the greatest thing in the world. I had my camera, and I actually took pictures. I have pictures. And that's how I kind of inserted myself and became kind of in the Time family. And then as sophomore in college, I kept in touch. I kept showing up. I went back the next year for 3 weeks, and they put me in the apartment of a photographer who was actually on assignment. It was a high school, stay in New York, and that they watched over me. But then I became an intern from Northwestern, and by sophomore year at Northwestern, I started having my pictures in Time magazine. I became one of their people in Chicago. And so really by showing up, and just by like, hey, how do you do that? Can I tag along? And then having coffee, at the right time.
I think you got into the room, and I think that's what matters. You got into the room, and I think that's what a lot of youth are struggling with nowadays, getting into the right rooms to discuss some of the problems they care about.
I showed up.
Yeah.
And what's ironic is that meetings that I'm in, I hear all the time, we need to get the youth. We need to get the media. Well, okay. Well, why are there no youth, so to speak, in the room?
Where are they?
Or why is there not some entrepreneurial young, youth, high school, college, whatever age, outside saying, hey, I'm here. And I'm going to bring my voice with a little humility, but creativity. And I'm going to be part of the conversation, or at least I'm going to be in the room. And I think a lot of people don't apply that superpower, particularly when you're in high school and college. And now the job market is so upended and confusing more than ever. Now it's show up, and then be speculative too. Pursue your passion. Don't sit on your hands. Get up an hour earlier in the morning and go do something that you can build a body of work around your interests, whether it's just personal development, wellness, or storytelling. Go out and capture some interviews of people that you can apply your license to be curious to.
I think speaking from a youth perspective, it's almost because I feel like now right now, schools and universities, it's become so competitive, and it's become almost like a conveyor belt, because the only way to live your life, or the only correct way to live your life, is to go to university, get a degree, and then get a job. And I feel most students, they don't want to mess with this formula almost that's been created because it seems to work. It worked for their parents, it worked for their grandparents. But then again, I also really appreciate Valars because they give us this opportunity to see the other side.
I totally agree with you, Olivia. I feel like sometimes the easiest thing to do is to follow the others. But we have so many young leaders, and even not that young, who want to make a change, and the people who are driving it all is the one that took a path a little bit on the side, and that was what brought them where they are. And I feel like it takes some courage, it takes some risk, but hearing those stories is really inspiring, and I hope that this will apply to me and to all of the others who are willing to make a change here.
And I think you're right. It takes a little bit of a risk, but it's not really that big of a risk. Yeah, there is a conveyor belt, and yeah, there is a linear path. It's your typical university, 4 years, you get your degree. Maybe you're lucky enough to go back and do a graduate degree. But what is it that you can add to that path? And also use the fact that you're a university student to be curious. I would spend my weekends down at the Chicago Tribune, just showing up, because nobody else was, even though I was not in the journalism program at Northwestern, and they have a strong journalism program. It's competitive in a supportive way. But here I was working for Time and hanging out at the Tribune on the weekends. Nobody else was, just because I could take my homework down and do the Tribune, but I was going to be a fixture in the room, and I wanted to hear and see how things worked. And when I came back as a master's student, when I came back with my professor and we had a 13,000 word story from that murder case, that first interview, I already knew, I knew the space, I knew the editor, the editors kind of seen me around. I was somewhat familiar. And when we presented all these words, I said, we can't really run these. And then I knew enough that pictures are important. And I pulled out the pictures that I'd taken along the way on this interview and portrait I'd done of the wife of and it was released. It went from not interested, the Tribune, it went to front page on Sunday in the newspaper, because, I'd been in the space, a little bit of trust, a little bit of familiarity.
Okay. I think that's a great way to end. We'll ask you our last question. Zlata, I don't know if you want to do the honors.
So as you want to keep everyone inspired and happy to continue, we want to ask you a little question with a little smile. What makes you happy? Truly yourself, and leave us with a little nice thought.
What makes me happy? Well, so many things do. Being around people that are inspiring, but it sounds funny, but I love water. I'm very passionate about water. I grew up on a lake in Michigan, and I love to try to have a water moment every day, particularly in the summertime. And that's swimming, paddling, just saying, here's why we exist, and maybe we can have a little bit of impact to save what's so dear to us.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Carl, today. That's it for today's conversation. Remember, small actions can create big ripples. A big thank you to Carl Ganter for joining us, and to all of you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, share your thoughts with us, subscribe to the podcast, and discover more inspiring content on villarsreview.org. This was The Ripple Effect. Thank you for listening. See you next time.